The rope burns into General Amara Steele's wrists as corrupt cops tie her to an ancient oak tree, their laughter echoing through the Georgia woods. "Some soldier you are now," Chief Vernon Hayes sneers, ripping the stars from her uniform. But what these small-town tyrants don't know is that every second of this humiliation is being transmitted directly to Fort Bragg, and in exactly 17 minutes, the entire 82nd Airborne will descend upon them like the wrath of God himself. Stay with me to witness how one woman's darkest hour becomes the downfall of an entire criminal empire, and drop a comment about where you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories of justice travel. The August heat pressed down on Highway 301 like a wet blanket, making the asphalt shimmer with false promises of water. General Amara Steele adjusted the air conditioning in her rented Tahoe, her decorated uniform crisp despite the oppressive humidity that seeped through every seal of the vehicle. 4 stars gleamed on her shoulders, each one earned through blood sacrifice and 28 years of service that had taken her from the streets of Detroit to the Pentagon's inner circle. She glanced at the GPS mounted on the dashboard. Millbrook, Georgia. Population 8,432. Another 17 miles. The folder on the passenger seat contained everything she needed to know about why the Department of Defense had sent her here alone and unofficial. Missing military equipment. Weapons that had vanished from nearby Fort Gordon's inventory, only to surface in cartel raids along the Mexican border. The trail led here to this forgotten corner of America, where Spanish moss hung from ancient oaks like nature's own shroud. "Command, this is Steele," she spoke into her encrypted phone. "Approaching target location, ETA 20 minutes. "Copy that, General," came the response from Colonel Marcus Webb, her aide back at the Pentagon. "Local law enforcement has been notified of your federal authority. They should provide full cooperation." Steele almost smiled at that. In her experience, small-town police and federal authority mixed about as well as oil and water. But the investigation required discretion. No convoy of military vehicles, no team of investigators. Just her asking questions that somebody clearly didn't want answered. The landscape changed as she drove deeper into Bullock County. The interstate's commercial sprawl gave way to 2-lane blacktop, then to roads where kudzu swallowed abandoned buildings whole. Confederate flags hung limp in the still air from porches of houses that hadn't seen fresh paint since Reagan was president. This was the South that time forgot, where family names meant more than federal law, and secrets stayed buried beneath red clay for generations. Her phone buzzed. Marcus again. "General, we're picking up some chatter from local police bands. They know you're coming." "Expected as much," she replied, slowing as she passed a speed trap sign partially hidden by overgrowth. "Maintain surveillance protocols." "Roger that. Your biosensor is transmitting clearly." The military watch on her wrist looked like any other smartwatch, but it was anything but ordinary. Constant GPS tracking audio recording vitals, monitoring all uploaded in real time to military satellites. Standard equipment for high-ranking officers operating in potentially hostile territory. She'd worn it in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria. Never thought she'd need it in Georgia. The first sign of trouble came subtle. A police cruiser trailing her for 3 miles, hanging back just far enough to seem coincidental. Then another joined from a side road. By the time she reached Millbrook's city limits, she had a 3-car escort, maintaining perfect formation behind her. The town itself looked like a movie set for Southern Gothic decay. The courthouse square dominated the center, its Confederate monument standing defiant, despite the ongoing national debate about such symbols. Storefronts stood empty except for a few survivors, a pawn shop, a payday loan office, a diner with windows so grimy they might have been frosted glass, and everywhere on every corner police cruisers, far too many for a town this size. Steele pulled into the parking lot of the Magnolia Motor Inn, the only accommodation Google had offered. The building slouched against the afternoon heat, its neon sign missing half its letters. The police cruisers pulled in behind her, blocking the exit. Not subtle, but then again, they weren't trying to be. She stepped out of the Tahoe, standing to her full 5'10" height shoulders, squared in the military bearing that had become second nature. The heat hit her like a physical force, instantly coating her skin with perspiration. 3 officers emerged from their vehicles, hands resting on their service weapons. "Afternoon, officers," she said, voice carrying the authority of someone used to commanding divisions. The lead cop, a thick-necked man whose uniform strained against his belly, spat tobacco juice onto the asphalt. His nameplate read Hutchins. "You lose your way, lady. General Steele, United States Army." She reached slowly for her identification. "I'm expected." Hutchins examined her credentials with theatrical slowness, tilting them against the sun, as if checking for forgery. "Says here you're from Washington." "That's correct." "Long way from home." He handed the ID back, his fingers deliberately brushing hers, lingering too long. "What brings military brass to our quiet little town?" "Official business. I have a meeting with your police chief at 4 o'clock. The 3 officers exchanged glances that might have been subtle to civilian eyes, but screamed coordination to someone trained in tactical observation. Hutchins smiled, showing teeth stained brown from years of tobacco. "Chief Hayes is particular about his appointments. Follow us. We'll escort you." It wasn't a request. The officers returned to their vehicles, waiting. Steele considered her options. She could assert federal authority, make a scene call for backup, but that would destroy any chance of a quiet investigation. Sometimes she'd learned you had to walk into the trap to find out who set it. She got back in the Tahoe and followed them. The police station should have been in the center of town near the courthouse. Instead, they led her down increasingly rural roads past rusted mailboxes and no trespassing signs shot through with bullet holes. The pavement gave way to gravel, then to dirt that raised clouds of red dust. Her GPS showed they were heading southeast, away from any population center. "Command, are you tracking?" she said quietly into her phone. "Every step, General. We show you 7 miles outside Millbrook proper." The convoy finally stopped at a cluster of buildings that looked more like a militia compound than a police facility. Chain-link fence topped with razor wire, guard towers that belonged on a military base, and more officers, at least a dozen, waiting in the yard. Chief Vernon Hayes stood in the center like a general reviewing his troops. He was everything central casting would want for a corrupt Southern lawman, 6'3", built like an ex-linebacker, gone slightly to seed with pale blue eyes that held all the warmth of a snake's. His uniform was custom-tailored, sharp enough to cut glass, with enough commendation ribbons to rival a North Korean general. "General Steele," he said, as she exited her vehicle, his accent thick as molasses. "Welcome to Millbrook, though I have to say, we weren't expecting federal interference in local matters." "No interference intended, Chief Hayes. Just following up on some inventory discrepancies at Fort Gordon. Routine investigation." Routine. He tasted the word like wine. "Nothing about military brass showing up in my town feels routine. Boys, I think the general might be carrying contraband. Need to conduct a search for officer safety." "That won't be necessary," Steele said, steel entering her voice. "I'm here under federal authority." "Federal authority." Hayes stepped closer, close enough that she could smell the cigarettes on his breath. "You see any federal buildings around here? Any federal agents, just you alone in my jurisdiction?" The circle of officers tightened. Steele's hand moved instinctively toward her sidearm, but she wasn't wearing one. Military officers didn't typically carry weapons stateside unless on duty at a base, a calculation she was beginning to regret. Stand down, Chief. This doesn't have to escalate. Hayes laughed, a sound like gravel in a cement mixer. Escalate. We're just conducting a routine traffic stop. Right, boys? The agreement came in a chorus of cruel chuckles. One officer younger than the rest, with Dietrich on his nameplate, actually looked uncomfortable. But peer pressure in a pack of wolves rarely favored the merciful. Search her vehicle, Hayes ordered. Thoroughly. They went through the Tahoe like locusts, dumping her overnight bag onto the dirt, scattering papers from her briefcase, even slashing the seats with knives, searching for hidden compartments. The folder with classified intelligence on the missing weapons disappeared into Hayes's hands. Interesting reading, he mused, flipping through pages. You know what I find fascinating, General? How federal types always think they're smarter than everyone else. Think they can walk into a place they don't understand and start making accusations. Those aren't accusations. They're facts. Serial numbers traced to weapons that were destroyed in a training accident 6 months ago. Tragic loss of government property. All documented. He lit a cigarette, blowing smoke in her direction. Unless you have evidence suggesting otherwise. The trap was elegant in its simplicity. The documentation would be perfect, every form filed, every witness statement aligned. Whatever crime had been committed, they'd had months to cover their tracks. And now they had her isolated, surrounded with no backup for 50 miles. I'll need to verify those records, she said. Of course. But First Officer Hutchins here says he smells marijuana coming from your vehicle. That's absurd. Are you calling my officer a liar? Hayes's voice hardened. Because that sounds like obstruction of justice, resisting arrest, maybe even assault on a peace officer if you keep getting aggressive. Steele recognized the script. She'd seen it played out in 100 YouTube videos of police encounters gone wrong. But those victims didn't have what she had: a direct satellite link to the Pentagon recording every word. I want to speak to my lawyer, she said clearly. Lawyers are for criminals, Hayes replied. Are you a criminal, General? Before she could answer, Hutchins moved behind her faster than his bulk suggested possible. His hand grabbed her wrist, twisting it behind her back in a control hold that sent fire through her shoulder. Gun! Someone shouted, though she was unarmed. The magic word that justified everything that came next. They took her down hard, face first, into the dirt. A knee pressed into her spine while hands roughly searched her, lingering, inappropriately accompanied by whispered comments that would constitute sexual assault in any legitimate arrest. The handcuffs clicked tight enough to cut off circulation. No weapons, Chief, Hutchins reported with false disappointment. Check again. And bag that watch. Could be a recording device. No. Steele's protest came out sharper than intended as Dietrich reached for her wrist. That's military property. Everything's evidence now, Hayes said. He knelt beside her, his voice dropping to a whisper, meant only for her. You should have stayed in Washington, General. Should have minded your own business. But you had to come down here thinking your stars meant something. Let me educate you about how things really work. They hauled her to her feet, her uniform torn and dirty dignity shredded. But the watch remained on her wrist. Dietrich had fumbled with the military-grade clasp, designed specifically to prevent removal without proper tools. Hayes waved it off, more interested in the psychological victory than operational security. Where are you taking me? She demanded, as they marched her toward a police van. Processing, Hayes said. Got to do everything by the book. Wouldn't want anyone claiming we violated your civil rights. The van had no windows in the back, no way to track where they were going. But the watch's GPS didn't need line of sight. Every turn, every mile uploaded to satellites, and from there to screens at the Pentagon, where Marcus Webb was undoubtedly raising 9 kinds of hell. They drove for 30 minutes by her count, deeper into nowhere. The road deteriorated until the van bounced and rattled with every pothole. When they finally stopped, the sliding door opened to reveal wilderness-thick forest that could have been anywhere in a 100-mile radius. "Out," Hayes ordered. She emerged into a small clearing dominated by a massive oak tree, its branches spreading like arthritic fingers against the evening sky. Spanish moss draped from every limb, creating curtains that obscured the view in every direction. The perfect place for things to happen that nobody would ever witness, except for the electronic witness on her wrist, faithfully transmitting everything. "You know what this tree is?" Hayes asked conversationally, running his hand along the deeply grooved bark. "The Judgment Oak. Been here since before the Civil War. Lot of history in this tree. Lot of justice dispensed." The implication hung in the air like the moss. This was a lynching tree, a place where justice had meant murder for anyone who challenged the established order. "Whatever you're planning," Steele said, "you're making a mistake. People know where I am. Military command thinks you're investigating stolen weapons." Hayes interrupted. "Tragic how you disappeared during that investigation. Probably ran off with your criminal conspirators when you realized we were onto your scheme." "My scheme." He pulled out a bag of white powder from his pocket. "Amazing what we found hidden in your vehicle. Enough cocaine to put you away for 20 years. Plus the stolen weapons in your hotel room. Oh, didn't I mention we've been busy while you were traveling?" The frame was comprehensive. Discredit, disgrace, disappear. By the time anyone sorted truth from lies, she'd be buried so deep in the system that even her rank wouldn't save her. Or buried in a more literal sense. "Tie her to the tree," Hayes ordered. "Chief," Dietrich spoke up, voice uncertain. Maybe you should remember who signs your paychecks, boy. Who keeps your mama's medical bills paid while she's fighting cancer." The younger officer's resistance crumbled. In a place like Millbrook, Hayes didn't just control the law, he controlled lives. Every mortgage, every medical crisis, every child's college fund depended on staying in his good graces. They used rope, not standard restraints. Rope that would leave marks, tell a story. They positioned her facing the tree, arms pulled around its massive trunk, wrists tied on the far side. The bark scraped against her cheek, rough and smelling of decay. "You wanted to investigate missing weapons," Hayes said from behind her. "Let me tell you what really happened. Yes, we sold them. To people who appreciate the Second Amendment, who understand that the federal government has no right to restrict American citizens' access to defense. Every weapon went to patriots who'll use them when the time comes." "When what time comes?" she asked, though she suspected she knew. "The reckoning. When real Americans take back what's ours from people like you. Career politicians, deep state operatives, military brass who've forgotten they serve the people, not Washington." He was confessing. Whether from arrogance or ignorance about her watch's capabilities, he was laying out the entire conspiracy. Each word transmitted to recording systems that would hold up in any court-martial or federal trial. The cartels, a convenient cover story, though I'll admit some weapons might have found their way south. Money is money, and the cause needs funding. He moved closer, his breath hot on her neck. "But you won't be reporting any of this. See, we've got a different story prepared. Decorated general PTSD from all those deployments, mental breakdown. Came down here paranoid, delusional, attacked police officers. We tried to help, but..." He trailed off, letting her imagination fill in the rest. "They'll come looking," she said. "Let them. They'll find a crazy woman who went AWOL, or they'll find nothing at all. Either way, problem solved." He grabbed her hair, pulling her head back. "Look at you. 4 stars. Probably think you're untouchable. But out here, you're just another uppity bitch who needs to learn her place. The others laughed, emboldened by their chief's cruelty. Someone took photos with their phone trophies of their conquest. They poured water over her head, soaking her uniform, making the fabric cling. More photos. More laughter. "Should we call the boys?" Hutchins suggested. "They'd love to see this." "Why not?" Hayes agreed. "Party's just getting started." Phone calls went out. Within 15 minutes, pickup trucks began arriving. Off-duty cops, friends, fellow travelers in whatever conspiracy Hayes was running. They brought beer, whiskey, and attitudes that belonged in a previous century. The clearing filled with toxic masculinity given permission to run wild. Someone had brought a knife. They used it to cut away her rank insignia, passing the stars around like party favors. Her name tape unit patches, every symbol of achievement and authority, stripped away and thrown into a growing fire they'd started in a barrel. 28 years of service, someone read from her personnel file they'd somehow acquired. Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria. Bronze Star, Silver Star, Purple Heart. Each commendation met with mockery. "Bet she killed American contractors over there," one voice speculated. "Covering up for Muslim terrorists?" "Probably a lesbian, too," another added. "They all are." The slurs continued, each more vile than the last. But through it all, Steele remained silent, except for necessary responses, knowing that every word was being recorded, building a case that would destroy them all. Hayes seemed to sense her confidence didn't match her circumstances. He leaned in close again. "You're awfully calm for someone about to disappear. Got some secret weapon backup coming?" "Just patient," she replied. "Patient." He considered this. "Well, let's see how patient you are when—" A phone rang. Not a casual ringtone, but an emergency alert. Then another, and another. Every phone in the clearing erupted simultaneously. Dietrich looked at his screen and went pale. "Chief, we've got a problem." "What kind of problem?" "Military aircraft. Lots of them. Inbound from Fort Bragg." Hayes snatched the phone. The screen showed a radar app, the kind aviation enthusiasts use to track flights. The display was lit up with contacts moving south at high speed. Military transponders not even trying to hide their approach. "How long?" Hayes demanded. 15 minutes, maybe less." The party atmosphere evaporated. Men who'd been brave in a mob suddenly remembered they had families, jobs, lives that could be destroyed by federal prosecution. They scattered toward their vehicles, but Hayes grabbed Hutchins. "Cut her loose, now. We say she was never here." "But the reports—" "Forget the reports. This never happened." They fumbled with the ropes, panic making their fingers clumsy. But military knots tied by professionals weren't meant to be quickly undone. The sound of helicopters grew from a distant rumble to a approaching thunder. "Leave her," someone shouted. "We need to go." "We can't leave evidence." "She is the evidence, you idiot." The first helicopter appeared over the tree line, a UH-60 Blackhawk that circled the clearing once before hovering. Ropes deployed and figures in full combat gear fast roped down. The 82nd Airborne Division, America's elite rapid deployment force, had arrived. The fleeing conspirators didn't make it 10 feet before they were face down in the dirt, zip-tied and secured. Professional soldiers moved with an efficiency that made the earlier police tactics look like children playing cops and robbers. A soldier with medical insignia cut Steele free, checking her wrists where the ropes had left angry marks. "General Steele, I'm Captain Rodriguez, combat medic. Are you injured?" "Nothing that won't heal, Captain." More helicopters arrived, disgorging more soldiers. Within minutes, the clearing looked like a forward operating base. Hayes and his inner circle knelt in a row, hands secured behind their backs, facing the very tree where they'd tied her. Colonel Marcus Webb himself stepped from the command helicopter, having flown directly from the Pentagon. His usually calm demeanor showed cracks of barely controlled rage as he surveyed the scene. "General," he said, saluting despite her disheveled appearance, "we have everything. Every word, every action transmitted and recorded. The Attorney General is personally preparing charges." "How many responded?" she asked, noting the extraordinary military presence. When the Pentagon received confirmation that a 4-star general was being assaulted by corrupt law enforcement, Webb's smile was sharp. "Sir, half the base volunteered. We had to turn people away." Hayes looked up from his kneeling position, face twisted with disbelief. "You can't do this. Posse comitatus. The military cannot engage in domestic law enforcement." Steele finished standing over him. "Except when responding to an attack on military personnel by enemies domestic. You assaulted a general officer of the United States Army. You confessed to selling military weapons. You threatened to murder a federal official. The president himself authorized this response." She knelt to meet his eyes at level. "You asked if I had a secret weapon. I did. The United States military doesn't abandon its own." Federal agents arrived within the hour, FBI and ATF taking custody of the conspirators. The investigation would eventually uncover a network spanning 3 states, hundreds of stolen weapons and connections to domestic extremist groups planning what they called the Day of Rope. Hayes would die in federal prison 17 years later, having never seen freedom again. But that was still to come. In that moment, Steele stood in the clearing as the sun set, watching justice arrive on rotor blades. She looked at the old oak tree, the judgment oak, that had seen so much injustice over the centuries. "We should cut it down," Webb suggested, following her gaze. "No," she said after a moment. "Let it stand. But change its story." Later, much later, after the trials and testimonies, after the restoration of stolen weapons and the purge of corrupt officials, Steele would return to that clearing. The judgment oak would bear a new plaque, brass gleaming in the Georgia sun. At this tree on August 15th, those who believed themselves above the law learned that justice, though delayed, cannot be denied. Let this place, once used for oppression, stand as testimony that the arc of the moral universe, however long, bends toward justice. The clearing would become a memorial park, a place where people came to remember that power without accountability is tyranny, whether wielded by those in uniform or those who disgrace it. School children would take field trips to learn about the day a general's courage exposed a conspiracy and how the full might of American justice descended upon a small town that had forgotten it was still part of America. But all of that was yet to come. In that moment, as helicopters lifted the arrested conspirators toward federal detention, General Amara Steele stood tall despite her torn uniform and bruised dignity. She had walked into the trap, sprung it, and turned it against those who set it. The judgment oak's shadow grew long across the clearing as the sun set on the old Millbrook. Tomorrow a new sun would rise on a town freed from the grip of corruption, its citizens able to breathe without fear for the first time in decades. Steele touched the rough bark one last time, feeling the scars of centuries. Every scar told a story. Now this tree had one more, not of injustice triumphant, but of justice delivered by rotor blade and righteousness, proving that in America no one is above the law, and no one stands alone when they stand for what's right. The federal agents worked through the night, their floodlights turning the clearing into an alien landscape of harsh shadows and clinical brightness. Steele remained on scene, refusing medical evacuation, despite Captain Rodriguez's repeated concerns about potential injuries. She needed to see this through, needed to watch as each piece of evidence was catalogued, each conspirator processed. The judgment oak stood witness to a different kind of justice, now its ancient branches creaking in the warm night breeze. "General, you should at least let me examine those rope burns properly." Rodriguez insisted, his medical kit open beside him. The young captain had the earnest dedication of someone who took his oath to first do no harm as seriously as any combat order. In a moment, Captain Steele replied, her attention focused on the FBI agents photographing the rope that had bound her. Every fiber would be analyzed, every knot documented. The federal prosecutor had already called twice, confirming that with the recorded confession and physical evidence, this would be what lawyers called a slam dunk case. Webb approached with a satellite phone. "Ma'am, the Secretary of Defense wants to speak with you." She took the phone, straightening her torn uniform, as if the secretary could see her through the connection. "General Steele here, sir." "Amara." Secretary James Thornton's voice carried the weight of barely controlled fury. "I've reviewed the transmitted recordings. What they did to you was worth it, sir. We have them. All of them. That's not the point. You could have been killed. But I wasn't. And now we have evidence of a conspiracy that goes far deeper than missing weapons. These people were planning something, sir. Something big." There was a pause on the other end. "How big?" Hayes mentioned the Day of Rope. In extremist circles, that's code for a coordinated uprising. Mass assassinations of government officials, military leadership, anyone deemed an enemy of their cause. The weapons from Fort Gordon were just the beginning. Christ! Thornton rarely swore a holdover from his Methodist upbringing. How many are involved? Unknown, but Hayes was confident enough to confess everything. That suggests a significant network. Sir, I recommend we treat this as a domestic terrorism investigation, not just arms trafficking. Agreed. I'm activating Joint Terrorism Task Force protocols. FBI, ATF, NSA, everyone gets read in. Amara, I need you to understand something. What happened tonight wasn't just an attack on you. It was an attack on the United States military. There will be consequences. Understood, sir. No, I don't think you do. The president is furious. He's talking about declaring martial law in 3 counties, having the 82nd conduct house-to-house searches. Steele felt a chill despite the warm night. Sir, that would be an overreaction. We need surgical precision, not a sledgehammer. These people see themselves as patriots, fighting government overreach. If we send in the military like an occupying force, we'll create more extremists than we capture. Then what do you recommend? She looked around the clearing at the federal agents methodically building their case, at the soldiers maintaining a security perimeter with professional calm. Let the system work, sir. Arrests, trials, public exposure of what they were planning. Sunshine is the best disinfectant. Show the American people what these so-called patriots really are: criminals who betrayed their oaths and sold weapons that could have been used against American soldiers. You're right, of course. It's just, they tied you to a tree, Amara, like it was 1955 instead of 2025. Yes, sir, they did. And in doing so, they revealed themselves. Every person who participated, everyone who laughed, everyone who took photos, they're all on record now. We know who they are. After ending the call, she finally allowed Rodriguez to properly examine her injuries. The rope burns were severe, likely to scar. Her shoulder, wrenched during the initial takedown, showed signs of soft tissue damage. Various bruises mapped a constellation of violence across her body. You need a hospital, General, Rodriguez said firmly. This shoulder needs an MRI. After we're done here. With respect, ma'am, we are done here. The FBI has the scene, the conspirators are in custody, and you've given your initial statement. There's nothing more you can accomplish tonight except potentially exacerbating your injuries. Webb added his voice to the medical opinion. He's right, Amara. You've done enough. More than enough. She wanted to protest, but exhaustion was setting in, adrenaline finally fading, to leave her aware of every ache, every insult her body had endured. Fine. But not a local hospital. I want military medical. Already arranged, Webb assured her. Medical evacuation to Fort Gordon. They have a full trauma center and it's secure. As she walked toward the waiting medical helicopter, she passed the line of arrested conspirators. Most kept their eyes down, the reality of their situation finally sinking in. But Vernon Hayes looked up, meeting her gaze with undiminished hatred. "This isn't over," he said quietly. "You think you've won, but you've just shown them where the battle lines are. The people won't stand for military occupation of American soil." She stopped, despite Rodriguez's gentle attempt to keep her moving. "You're right about one thing, Hayes. This isn't over. But not in the way you think. Every weapon you sold will be traced. Every person you sold them to will be found. Every member of your conspiracy will be rolled up. Your revolution dies tonight, and it dies because you couldn't resist humiliating one woman. Your ego, your need to dominate, that's what destroyed you. Remember that in federal prison." His face contorted with rage, but the FBI agents pulled him to his feet, leading him toward the transport vehicle. The last she saw of Vernon Hayes was his back disappearing into custody's shoulders, slumped in defeat. The helicopter ride to Fort Gordon took 30 minutes, during which Steele finally allowed herself to close her eyes. But she didn't sleep. Instead, she thought about the investigation to come, the trials, the inevitable political fallout. A small-town police force had been revealed as a criminal organization. The questions would be brutal. How had this been allowed to happen? How many other Millbrooks were out there? The hospital at Fort Gordon had been alerted to expect a VIP patient. Steele found herself in a private room with more security than some foreign dignitaries received. Nurses and doctors treated her with a mixture of professional medical detachment and barely concealed awe. Word had already spread through the base about what had happened, how she had single-handedly exposed a massive conspiracy. "General Steele." A young lieutenant appeared at her door as a nurse finished rebandaging her wrists. "I'm Lieutenant Sarah Kim Jag Kaur. I've been assigned to assist with your legal needs during the investigation." "I wasn't aware I needed legal assistance, Lieutenant." Kim entered carrying a thick folder. "You don't, ma'am. But given the scope of what's been uncovered, the prosecution wants to ensure every detail is perfect. Your testimony will be the cornerstone of the case." "How many arrests so far?" 47 as of an hour ago. FBI expects that to double by morning. They're executing search warrants across 3 states based on intelligence from Hayes' communications. Steele accepted the folder, scanning through initial reports. The conspiracy was even larger than Hayes had suggested. Stolen weapons had been distributed to militia groups, motorcycle clubs with extremist ties, even some private military contractors who'd been discharged for extremist views. It was an army in waiting, armed with military-grade weapons, waiting for someone to give the order to move. "Ma'am," Kim continued, "there's something else. Some of the arrested officers are trying to claim whistleblower status, saying they were gathering evidence of corruption and you were interfering." "Of course they are. The prosecutors aren't worried. The recordings from your watch are unambiguous. But they want to prepare you for the media circus this is going to become. Someone leaked to CNN. The story breaks nationally in 6 hours." Steele sighed. She'd hoped for more time before the media got involved, but in the age of social media, secrets had the lifespan of mayflies. "What's the angle?" "Heroic general exposes domestic terrorism plot." "You're going to be famous, ma'am. The kind of famous that gets book deals and movie rights." "I'm a soldier, Lieutenant, not a celebrity." "With respect, General, after tonight, you're both." The young JAG officer was right. By morning, Steele's face was on every news channel. The photo that became iconic was one the conspirators themselves had taken her tied to the tree uniform, torn, but chin raised in defiance. Someone had leaked it, thinking it would humiliate her. Instead, it became a symbol of resistance against corruption and extremism. The president addressed the nation that evening, flanked by the Joint Chiefs and the Attorney General. He spoke of the cancer of extremism that had metastasized in forgotten corners of America, of those who would betray their oaths for ideology and profit. He praised Steele's courage but was careful to emphasize that she was not alone, that the full might of American justice stood behind every citizen who stood up to corruption. But in her hospital room, Steele focused on the investigation unfolding on her laptop. The FBI had shared access to their preliminary findings, and the scope was staggering. Vernon Hayes hadn't just been running a criminal enterprise, he'd been building a shadow government for Bullock County and beyond. His network included judges, county commissioners, business owners, even some state legislators. They called themselves the Constitutional Guard, believing they were the true defenders of American values against a corrupted federal system. Marcus Webb arrived the next morning with coffee and updates. "The SEC just got involved," he announced. Turns out Hayes was funding his operation through an elaborate cryptocurrency scheme. We're talking millions in untraceable funds. "Follow the money," Steele murmured, an old investigative axiom. Where was it going? Weapons, obviously, but also propaganda. They were funding podcasts, YouTube channels, even some legitimate-looking news sites, all pushing the narrative that the federal government is the enemy of the people. Information warfare. She recognized the strategy from foreign adversaries now being employed by American citizens against their own country. They were preparing the battlefield, getting people ready to support them when they made their move. The question is, when were they planning to move? Steele pulled up a calendar on her laptop. Hayes mentioned the Day of Rope. In extremist literature, that's often tied to significant dates. Federal holidays when government offices are closed, historical anniversaries that resonate with their cause. She studied the coming months. Veterans Day. They were going to move on Veterans Day. That's less than 3 months away. A coordinated strike when federal response would be slowest, using the holiday as cover. Think about it, gathering of veterans, many of whom might be sympathetic to anti-government rhetoric. Weapons already distributed, communications networks in place. It would have been chaos. Webb immediately got on his phone to relay this theory to the investigation team. Within hours, FBI agents were finding confirmation training schedules that peaked in early November, coded communications about the November action, stockpiles of supplies dated for October delivery. Dietrich, the young officer who had shown reluctance during her assault, became the investigation's most valuable asset. Facing life in prison, he broke completely, providing detailed information about the conspiracy's structure, its membership, its plans. He revealed that he'd been trying to gather evidence himself, planning to go to the FBI, but hadn't found the courage until it was too late. "I have a daughter," he told FBI interrogators in a recording Steele later reviewed. 7 years old. Hayes had photos of her at school at dance class. He never said it directly, but I knew what would happen if I crossed him. Everyone knew. He owned us. It was a familiar story in places where corruption took root, not just greed, but fear, not just criminals, but victims forced to become accomplices. The investigation would have to separate the willing participants from the coerced, the true believers, from those just trying to survive. On her third day in the hospital, Steele received an unexpected visitor. Angela Hayes, the chief's wife, stood at her door with red-rimmed eyes and shaking hands. "I shouldn't be here," Angela began. "Mrs. Hayes, please just listen. I need you to know. Not everyone in Millbrook is like Vernon. Most people are good, decent folk who just wanted to live their lives. But Vernon and his crowd, they took over everything. You couldn't get a business license without their approval. Couldn't get your kid into the good schools without playing along. They strangled the whole town. Why didn't anyone report it? Angela laughed bitterly. To who? The police. The sheriff was Vernon's cousin. The state police, half of them were on his payroll. The FBI. You saw what happened when federal authorities showed up. They were ready for you. But not ready enough. No, Angela agreed. They underestimated you. Vernon always underestimated women. Thought we were weak, controllable. It's why he could never see the rebellion building in his own home. She pulled out a flash drive from her purse. 20 years of marriage, I documented everything. Every crime, every payoff, every threat. I was waiting for the right moment, the right person to give this to. Someone they couldn't kill or buy or threaten into silence. Steele took the drive carefully. This is evidence. You need to give it to the FBI. I will. But I wanted you to see it first. You earned that right when you let them tie you to that tree to expose them. That took a kind of courage I don't have. You're here now. That takes courage too. Angela shook her head. I'm here because Vernon's in federal custody and can't hurt me anymore. You walked into that clearing knowing what might happen. That's different. After Angela left, Steele examined the drive's contents on a secure laptop Webb provided. It was a treasure trove: photos of meetings, recorded conversations, financial documents. Angela Hayes had been building a case against her husband for years, waiting for someone strong enough to use it. The investigation accelerated. By the end of the week, 127 arrests had been made across 5 states. The Constitutional Guard was revealed to be larger than anyone had imagined, with cells in major cities planning coordinated attacks on federal buildings, military bases, even the homes of government officials. The weapons from Fort Gordon were just one source. They'd been acquiring military hardware through dozens of thefts, straw purchases, and corrupt military personnel. Steele was released from the hospital after 5 days, her shoulder in a sling, but otherwise mobile. She returned to Washington to find herself at the center of a political firestorm. Congress was demanding hearings on how such a conspiracy could have grown undetected. The military was conducting its own investigation into how weapons could have been stolen so easily. And the media wanted to tell her story, offering increasingly lucrative deals for exclusive interviews. She turned them all down, focusing instead on the work. The prosecution needed her testimony, and she spent long days in secure facilities reviewing evidence, providing context, helping build unassailable cases against the conspirators. But her mind kept returning to Millbrook, to the town held hostage by its own police force. The arrest of Hayes and his inner circle had created a power vacuum. The good people Angela Hayes had spoken of needed help rebuilding their community, establishing legitimate governance, healing from years of oppression. I want to go back, she told Webb over dinner a month after the incident. To Millbrook. Why? To finish what we started. Removing the cancer is only half the treatment. Now we need to help the patient heal. That's not military work, Amara. That's social services, community organizing. It's hearts and minds, she countered. The same thing we did in Iraq and Afghanistan, but this time for American citizens who've been living under occupation by their own corrupted authorities. Webb studied her for a long moment. You're serious. Dead serious. The Constitutional Guard didn't spring from nothing. It grew because people felt abandoned by their government, left behind by progress, forgotten by those in power. If we don't address those root causes, another Vernon Hayes will rise to exploit that resentment. The Pentagon won't authorize military involvement in civilian reconstruction. Then I'll take leave. Do it as a private citizen. After what they did to you there, she thought of the judgment oak of its centuries of witnessing both cruelty and justice. especially because of what they did. We can't let that place remain a symbol of their power. We need to transform it into something better. The conversation continued late into the night, but Steele had made up her mind. The investigation would continue, the trials would proceed, justice would be served. But justice without reconciliation was just revenge, and revenge bred more extremism. Someone had to break the cycle. 2 months later, as the first of the conspirators began taking plea deals and Vernon Hayes was indicted on 37 federal charges, Steele returned to Millbrook. This time she came not as an investigator, but as a citizen armed not with federal authority, but with resources and determination to help a wounded town heal. The Judgment Oak still stood in its clearing, now marked with yellow tape as a crime scene. But Steele saw past the tape to what it could become, not just a memorial to one night of exposed corruption, but a symbol of American resilience, of communities choosing hope over hatred, rebuilding over revenge. The morning sun cast long shadows across Millbrook's empty main street, as Steele parked her rental car in front of the same diner she'd passed months ago. The grimy windows had been cleaned, she noticed, and a new sign hung in the door, "Under new management." Small changes, but changes nonetheless. She pushed through the door to find the place half-full, conversations dying, as locals recognized her. The woman behind the counter, gray-haired and stern-faced, approached with a coffee pot. "General Steele," she said, neither welcoming nor hostile. "Heard you were coming back." "Just Ms. Steele now," Amara replied. "I'm here as a civilian." "Civilian?" The woman whose name tag read Dolores seemed to taste the word. "That what you call it when someone comes to gawk at the wreckage they caused? That's not why I'm here." "Then why Vernon Hayes is gone, his boys are locked up or fled. Half the town's unemployed because the businesses they worked for were seized as criminal enterprises. We got FBI agents going through our garbage and reporters asking our kids if their daddies were terrorists. So tell me, Ms. Steele, why are you here?" Before Steele could answer, another voice cut through the tension. "Because I asked her to come, Dolores." Angela Hayes emerged from the kitchen wearing an apron and looking like she'd aged a decade in 2 months. The widow of the town's former tyrant faced its skeptical citizens with quiet dignity. "Angela," Dolores said, surprise evident. "You didn't say nothing about—" "I said I was bringing in someone to help with the community rebuilding project. This is her." Angela moved to stand beside Steele. "And before anyone says anything, yes, I know what she did to Vernon. Or rather, what Vernon did to himself by attacking her. But that's done. The question now is whether we're going to sit in these ashes feeling sorry for ourselves, or whether we're going to rebuild something better." An older man in overalls spoke from a corner booth. "Rebuild with what federal government seized all the assets. Banks won't loan to nobody associated with the Constitutional Guard, which was half the town, whether they wanted to be or not." "That's why I'm here," Steele said. "I've established a non-profit foundation with initial funding of $5 million. It's specifically for communities recovering from systemic corruption. Millbrook is our pilot program." The diner erupted in voices, some angry, some hopeful, most simply confused. Dolores raised her hand for silence. $5 million, she said slowly. "That's guilt money, isn't it? You feeling bad about destroying our town?" "I didn't destroy your town," Steele replied evenly. "Vernon Hayes and his conspirators did that. They turned your police into a criminal organization, your businesses into money laundering operations, your community into a hostage. I just exposed it. Now I'm offering to help fix it." "And what's the catch?" the man in overalls demanded. "Government doesn't give nothing without strings." "It's not government money. It's private funding from donors who believe in second chances. The only string is that the community has to want to change. You have to be willing to work with federal authorities to ensure the corruption doesn't return. You have to be willing to tell the truth about what happened here. Truth. Dolores laughed bitterly. You want us to testify against our neighbors, turn into a town of snitches. I want you to be a town of citizens, Steele countered. There's a difference between snitching and civic responsibility. When you see crime and stay silent, you become complicit. That's how Vernon Hayes held power for so long. Everyone was too scared or too compromised to speak up. Angela moved through the diner, refilling coffee cups with practiced ease. She's right. We all knew what Vernon was doing. We told ourselves we were protecting our families by staying quiet, but really we were enabling him. I did it for 20 years, no more. Easy for you to say, someone called out. You got immunity for testifying. Immunity from prosecution, Angela shot back. Not from conscience. Not from the looks I get every day from people whose lives were ruined by my husband. Not from knowing I could have stopped him years ago if I'd been brave enough. Steele pulled out a folder from her bag. Here's what the Foundation is proposing. Job retraining programs for those who lost employment. Small business grants for legitimate enterprises. Educational scholarships for young people who want to leave for college. Mental health services for those traumatized by years of living under Hayes's regime. And a Truth and Reconciliation Commission modeled after what South Africa did after apartheid. You comparing Millbrook to apartheid? Dolores asked, incredulous. I'm comparing systematic oppression to systematic oppression. The scale is different, but the principle is the same. A community divided against itself cannot heal without acknowledging what happened and why. Over the next hours, more people filtered into the diner. Word had spread that Steele was back, and curiosity overcame caution. She fielded questions, absorbed anger, weathered accusations. Through it all, Angela Hayes stood by her, an unexpected ally in an hostile environment. By afternoon, Steele had arranged to meet with the emergency administration the state had appointed to run Millbrook after most of its government was arrested. The temporary mayor, a retired judge named William Carson, brought in from Atlanta, greeted her with weary relief. Ms. Steele, I'll be honest, this town is hanging by a thread. We've got no functioning police force, the tax base has collapsed, and half the population thinks the federal government is occupying them. What do you need most urgently? Law enforcement. The state police are stretched thin, covering for our non-existent department. Crime is actually down. Turns out most of it was being committed by the police themselves, but people feel vulnerable. I might have a solution for that. Steele pulled out her phone, calling a contact she'd cultivated over the past months. Colonel Rodriguez, it's Steele. That program we discussed, I think Millbrook is ready. She ended the call and turned back to Carson. The Defense Department has a new initiative, military veterans transitioning to civilian law enforcement. We can have 12 qualified vetted officers here within 2 weeks. All veterans with spotless records trained in community policing rather than occupation tactics. The people won't accept outsiders as police. Not after everything. They will if those outsiders prove themselves, and they will if local citizens are part of the oversight. I'm proposing a civilian review board with real teeth able to investigate complaints and terminate officers who abuse their position. Carson leaned back, studying her. You've thought this through. I've had 2 months to think about little else. Millbrook isn't unique, Judge Carson. There are dozens of small towns across America where corruption has taken root, where citizens feel abandoned by their government and vulnerable to extremist exploitation. If we can fix Millbrook, we create a model for fixing all of them. That evening, Steele stood again in the clearing with the judgment oak. The crime scene tape was gone, but the space still felt haunted. She touched the bark where the rope had scraped it raw, feeling the rough texture against her fingertips. Talking to trees now. She turned to find Dietrich, the young officer who'd shown reluctance that night. He was out on bail awaiting trial wearing an ankle monitor and looking like he'd lost 30 pounds. "Mr. Dietrich, I'm surprised to see you here." "It's just Tom now. Lost the right to be called officer." He approached slowly, hands visible, no threat in his posture. "I come here sometimes. Try to understand how it all went so wrong. Any insights?" He stood beside her, both of them looking up at the massive oak. "It was gradual. That's what I tell the FBI. Hayes didn't start out evil. He was a good cop once, maybe even a great one. But power without accountability, it's like cancer. Grows slow at first, then takes over everything. You could have stopped it." "Could I? I was 23 when I joined the force. Hayes was already chief, already had his network. First time I questioned something, he showed me those photos of my daughter. Made it clear what kind of accidents can happen to little girls who walk home from school alone." "So you became complicit?" "I became a coward," Tom corrected. "Don't pretty it up. I watched Hayes destroy people, watched him sell weapons to extremists, watched him build his little empire. I told myself I was protecting my family, but really I was just protecting myself." They stood in silence for a moment before Tom continued. "That night, when they brought you here, I almost shot Hayes myself. Almost ended it right there. But I was still too scared. Even with you tied to that tree, even knowing it was being recorded, I was too scared to act. But you're acting now. Your testimony will put dozens of conspirators away. Too little, too late. My daughter won't even look at me. My wife filed for divorce. And I'll probably spend the next decade in federal prison." "You could leave," Steele observed. "Jump bail, disappear." Tom actually smiled at that. "With this ankle monitor, besides running would just prove Hayes was right, that when push comes to shove, we're all just criminals looking out for ourselves. No, I'll face what I did. Maybe that'll mean something to my daughter someday." He walked away, leaving Steele alone with the oak. She'd brought camping gear, planning to spend the night in the clearing, not from any morbid fascination with her trauma, but because she needed to reclaim this space in her mind. The oak had stood for centuries before Vernon Hayes corrupted its purpose. It would stand for centuries after bearing witness to whatever came next. As darkness fell, she built a small fire in the rusted barrel the conspirators had left behind. The flames cast dancing shadows on the tree's trunk, creating patterns that shifted and writhed like living things. She thought about Tom Dietrich's words about the slow cancer of corruption. How many other Tom Dietrichs were out there trapped between conscience and coercion? Her phone rang, Webb's name on the screen. "Amara, I've got news. Vernon Hayes wants to make a deal." "What kind of deal?" "Full confession, complete list of Constitutional Guard members, details of the planned November action. Everything in exchange for life without parole instead of the death penalty." The death penalty was never really on the table. He doesn't know that. His lawyers convinced him that attacking a general officer during what could be construed as insurrection makes him eligible for execution. Steele considered this. "What does the prosecution want?" "They want your input. You're the victim here." "I'm one victim. There are hundreds of others, everyone who lived under Hayes's thumb for years. They should have a say." "The prosecutor needs an answer by tomorrow." "Then I'll give him one tomorrow after I've talked to the town." She ended the call and returned to watching the fire. Around midnight, she heard vehicles approaching. Not the roar of helicopters this time, but the quiet rumble of pickup trucks. She stood, hand moving instinctively to where her sidearm would have been. 3 trucks pulled into the clearing, their headlights blinding after the darkness. Figures emerged, moving toward her with purpose, but not hostility. As her eyes adjusted, she recognized faces from the diner: Dolores, the man in overalls whose name she'd learned was Earl Angela Hayes, and a dozen others. "Heard you were camping out here," Dolores said. "Figured you might want some company." They'd brought folding chairs, coolers, even a guitar. Without asking permission, they set up around her fire, transforming her solitary vigil into a community gathering. Someone passed her a beer. Someone else started strumming the guitar. "This tree," Earl said, after a while his voice carrying the weight of memory. "My grandfather told me stories about it. Not the bad ones everyone knows, but other stories. Couples getting married beneath its branches back in the 1800s. Town meetings held in its shade before there was a town hall. Children playing in its roots. It wasn't always a place of evil." "Nothing is always anything," Angela added. "Places like people are what we make them." Dolores, who'd been hostile earlier, now seemed thoughtful. "My boy joined the army last year. Said he wanted to serve his country, get away from Millbrook's reputation. When he heard what happened to you here, he called me crying. Said he was ashamed to be from here." "He shouldn't be," Steele said. "Being from here isn't what defines him. What he does next is." "What any of us do next," Earl corrected. "That's why we're here, isn't it? To figure out what comes next." The conversation continued through the night. Stories, shared grievances, aired ideas proposed. They talked about Hayes's deal, about justice versus revenge, about how to rebuild not just buildings and businesses, but trust and community. As dawn approached, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Dolores stood and addressed the group. "I've lived in Millbrook my whole life, 63 years come November. I've seen it at its best and worst. What Vernon Hayes did to this town, what we let him do, that's our shame to carry. But shame ain't got to be permanent. We can choose to be different." She turned to Steele. "You asked what we want to do about Hayes's deal. I say take it. Not because he deserves mercy, but because we need to know everything. Every name, every crime, every secret. Can't heal a wound without cleaning it first, no matter how much it hurts." The others murmured agreement. Angela Hayes, whose vote carried perhaps the most weight given her unique position, nodded slowly. "Vernon destroyed so many lives. Taking his won't undo that. But making him reveal everything, making him help tear down what he built, that's a kind of justice too." Steele called the prosecutor as the sun fully rose, relaying the community's decision. Hayes would get his deal, but with conditions. He would have to allocute in open court in Millbrook, facing the people he'd terrorized. He would have to detail every crime name, every conspirator, explain every aspect of his network. And the recording of his confession from that night at the Oak would be played in full so everyone could hear his true nature. The gathering broke up slowly, people returning to their homes and responsibilities. But something had changed in those overnight hours. The Oak had witnessed something different, not violence or conspiracy, but community beginning to heal. Angela lingered after the others left. "You know they're calling you the general who wouldn't break? There's talk of putting up a statue." "God, I hope not," Steele said with genuine alarm. "Not of you," Angela clarified. "Of the idea. Of standing up to corruption, even when you're standing alone. The children here need heroes who aren't wearing white hoods or carrying Confederate flags." Over the following weeks, Steele's foundation began its work in earnest. The veteran police officers arrived, led by a former Marine captain named James Washington, who'd served 3 tours in Afghanistan before losing his left leg to an IED. He walked with a slight limp, but carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who'd faced real enemies, not manufactured ones. "I've been studying what happened here," Washington told Steele during their first meeting in the restored police station. Hayes created a protection racket, basically, made people afraid of outside threats while being the actual threat himself. Classic authoritarian tactics, Steele agreed. Create the problem, then position yourself as the only solution. Well, we're going to try something different. Community policing, emphasis on community. My officers will walk beats, not just drive patrols. They'll attend town meetings, school events, church services if invited. They need to be seen as neighbors who happen to be cops, not occupiers with badges. The approach met resistance at first. Some citizens saw any police as a continuation of Hayes's regime. Others, particularly those who'd been part of the Constitutional Guard's support network, viewed the new officers as federal plants. But gradually, through consistent, transparent action, the new department began earning trust. The first real test came when one of Hayes's former lieutenants, who'd fled before the arrests, returned to town, armed and threatening to take back what's mine. Washington and his officers handled the situation without firing a shot, using negotiation and patience rather than force. The man was arrested, but also treated with dignity, given medical attention for the mental health crisis he was clearly experiencing. "See, that's the difference," Dolores told customers in her diner afterward. "Hayes would have shot first and made up a story later. These new boys, they actually protect and serve." The Truth and Reconciliation Commission began its work in the courthouse, the same building where Hayes had held court like a medieval lord. Citizens came forward to tell their stories, businesses destroyed for refusing to pay protection, teenagers recruited into extremist ideology, families torn apart by the culture of fear and suspicion Hayes had cultivated. Tom Dietrich testified for 3 full days, detailing not just Hayes's crimes, but the systematic way he'd corrupted the entire department. His testimony was painful to hear, filled with self-recrimination and genuine remorse. When he finished, the commission faced a difficult question: how to balance justice with the reality that many conspirators were also victims. "We recommend graduated accountability." The commission's chair, a retired federal judge brought in for neutrality, announced. "Those who initiated and profited from corruption face full prosecution. Those who were coerced or acted under duress receive reduced sentences with mandatory community service. Those who came forward voluntarily with information receive the most leniency." It wasn't perfect, no solution could be, but it offered a path forward that acknowledged the complex reality of how corruption operates. The transformation of Millbrook didn't happen overnight. There were setbacks, moments when old resentments flared, when federal authority and local autonomy clashed. But slowly, month by month, the town began to recover. New businesses opened with foundation grants. Young people who'd fled returned with new skills and ideas. The local newspaper, shut down by Hayes years ago for asking uncomfortable questions, resumed publication. 6 months after her return, Steele stood once again at the Judgment Oak, but this time she wasn't alone. The clearing was full of people, citizens of Millbrook, state officials, even some military brass who'd come to see what she'd accomplished. They were here for the dedication of the memorial, the transformation of a site of oppression into one of remembrance and resolve. The plaque she'd envisioned was installed at the base of the tree, but it was accompanied by something more, a series of smaller plaques, each bearing the name of someone who'd stood up to corruption, from whistleblowers who'd tried to expose Hayes years ago to citizens who'd testified before the commission, despite threats and intimidation. "This tree has stood for over 300 years, Steele addressed the crowd. "It's witnessed the worst of what we can do to each other. Slavery lynching the corruption of law into lawlessness. But it's also witnessed our capacity to change, to choose justice over vengeance, truth over comfortable lies." Vernon Hayes watched the ceremony from his federal prison cell, the television in the common area showing news coverage of the event. He'd aged decades in months, his swagger replaced by the hollow look of a man who'd lost everything. The other inmates avoided him, even among criminals. There was no respect for someone who'd betrayed the badge so completely. "That should have been my legacy," he muttered to no one. "It is," his cellmate, a bank robber doing 15 years, replied. "Just not the way you wanted." Back in Millbrook, as the ceremony concluded, and people began dispersing, Angela Hayes approached Steele one last time. "I'm leaving," she said simply. "Starting over in Oregon. My sister lives there. You don't have to go, this is your home. Was my home. But some ghosts are too heavy to live with. The town needs to heal without constant reminders of what Vernon did. And I need to find out who I am when I'm not Vernon Hayes's wife." She handed Steele an envelope. "This is for the foundation. It's not much, but it's everything I could legally keep from Vernon's assets. I want it to go to education scholarships for kids who want to study criminal justice, become the kind of cops Vernon pretended to be." They embraced briefly, two women bound by trauma, but not defined by it. As Angela drove away, Steele realized that this too was a form of justice, the freedom to leave, to start over, to not be forever frozen in the worst moment of your life. The sun set behind the Judgment Oak, casting long shadows across the clearing that was no longer a crime scene but a place of pilgrimage for those seeking to understand how good communities go bad and how bad communities can recover. Steele would leave soon, return to her military duties, her official life. But part of her would always remain here in this small Georgia town that had faced its demons and chosen to be better. The oak stood witness to it all, its ancient branches reaching toward a sky that held both memory and promised darkness and light, the weight of history and the possibility of redemption. It would continue standing long after everyone present was gone, a testament to the endurance of truth over lies, community over corruption, hope over hatred. And somewhere in its scarred bark, where rope had once bound a general who refused to break new growth, was already beginning to cover the wounds, not erasing them, but incorporating them into something stronger, more resilient, more honestly American than Vernon Hayes could have ever understood. The Foundation's work in Millbrook had been running smoothly for 3 months when the encrypted phone call came through to Steele's Pentagon office. She recognized the number FBI Special Agent Diana Chen, who'd been leading the broader investigation into the Constitutional Guard network. "General, we have a problem," Chen said without preamble. "Vernon Hayes was attacked in federal prison yesterday. He's alive but in critical condition." Steele set down the report she'd been reading on military readiness. Who was responsible? That's the problem. The attacker was Raymond Knox, doing life for murder. But Knox has no connection to Hayes, no reason to want him dead. We think someone paid him or pressured him. Hayes' own people trying to silence him. That was our first thought. But Knox is talking. Says he got word that Hayes was planning to reveal something big, something that wasn't in his original confession. Something about Prometheus. The word sent a chill through Steele. During her initial investigation into the missing weapons, she'd found a single reference to Prometheus in encrypted communications, but the trail had gone cold. What else did Knox say? Just that whoever wanted Hayes silenced, said Prometheus, would burn everything down if exposed. "General, I think we're looking at something bigger than the Constitutional Guard." Within hours, Steele was on a military transport back to Georgia, this time accompanied by a full security detail. The attack on Hayes suggested active conspiracy members still operating, still dangerous. The federal prison where Hayes was being held had been locked down, all inmates confined to cells, while investigators combed through every interaction Hayes had had in the past weeks. She found Hayes in the prison medical wing, handcuffed to a bed, despite the breathing tube down his throat and the monitors tracking his failing vitals. His eyes tracked to her when she entered, showing recognition, and something else, fear. "Mr. Hayes," she said, pulling a chair close to his bed. "Agent Chen says you have information about Prometheus. Blink once for yes." A single deliberate blink. "Is Prometheus a person?" 2 blinks. "No." "An operation?" 1 blink. "Yes." She continued the painstaking process of yes or no questions, building a picture from Hayes's responses. Prometheus was an operation larger than the Constitutional Guard, involving military personnel, defense contractors, and foreign actors. The weapons stolen from Fort Gordon were just a test run for something much bigger planned for military bases across the country. "Foreign actors," she repeated. "Russian, 2 blinks. Chinese, 2 blinks. Middle Eastern." Hayes's eyes darted toward the door, then back to her. 1 blink, but followed immediately by 2. Yes and no. "Some Middle Eastern, but not all." 1 blink. Before she could continue, alarms began blaring throughout the prison. The guard stationed at Hayes's door spoke rapidly into his radio, then turned to Steele. "General, we need to move you to secure lockdown. There's been a breach in perimeter security." "What kind of breach?" The lights went out before he could answer. Emergency lighting kicked in a second later, bathing everything in red. Through the reinforced window, Steele could see figures in tactical gear moving through the corridor, but something was wrong. Their movements were too professional, too coordinated for a prison riot. "Those aren't inmates," she said, drawing her sidearm. The guard reached for his radio, but jerked and fell a dart protruding from his neck. The door burst open, and 3 figures entered, faces hidden behind military-grade tactical masks. They moved with the fluid efficiency of Special Forces weapons trained on steel. "Drop the weapon, General," the lead figure said, voice distorted by the mask's modulator. "We're not here for you." "Then you can turn around and leave," she replied, keeping her weapon steady. "Can't do that. Hayes knows too much about Prometheus. Should have kept his mouth shut, but some people never learn." They were going to kill Hayes, silence him permanently, but they'd made a tactical error. They'd entered a small room with limited maneuverability, and Steele had spent 3 decades training for close-quarters combat. She dove left, firing as she moved. Her first shot caught one attacker in the shoulder, spinning him around. The second went wide as she rolled behind Hayes's bed. Return fire shredded the mattress above Hayes, who could only watch helplessly as bullets passed inches from his face. The lead attacker flanked right, trying to get an angle, but Steele had already moved, using the IV stand as an improvised weapon to strike his knee. He stumbled, and she brought her elbow up into his throat, feeling the cartilage crush beneath the blow. His weapon clattered across the floor. The third attacker had her dead-to-rights rifle aimed at her center mass. Time slowed as Steele saw his finger tighten on the trigger. Then his head snapped back, blood spraying the white wall behind him. Through the doorway, she saw Captain Rodriguez lowering a smoking rifle. "Sorry we're late, General," he said, leading a squad of Army Rangers into the room. Traffic was murder. The attempted assassination made national headlines. 3 dead attackers who carried no identification, used untraceable weapons, and had somehow penetrated federal prison security like it was made of tissue paper. The surviving attacker, the one Steele had shot in the shoulder, died from cyanide poisoning before interrogation, a hollow tooth Cold War style. Hayes, traumatized by nearly being killed twice in as many days, became desperately cooperative. The FBI arranged for him to be moved to a military medical facility where Steele could properly interrogate him once the breathing tube was removed. Prometheus was supposed to be the rebirth, he wheezed, his voice damaged from the intubation. Like the Greek myth stealing fire from the gods, except we were stealing weapons from the military-industrial complex. "Who's we?" Steele asked. "The network. Constitutional Guard was just one piece. There's groups in 12 states, maybe more. military contractors selling weapons off the books, officers providing intel and access, foreign money funding it all. Which foreign money? Hayes coughed, specks of blood hitting his lips. Saudi princes who want to destabilize America, Russian oligarchs who profit from chaos, Chinese intelligence playing all sides. They don't work together, hell, they probably don't even know about each other. But they all fund different pieces of Prometheus. What's the end goal? November 15th. Coordinated raids on 5 major military arsenals. Fort Bragg, Fort Hood Camp, Pendleton, 2 others I don't know. Steal enough weapons to arm a revolution. The Constitutional Guard revolt was supposed to provide cover-draw federal resources away from the real targets. Steele felt the magnitude of the threat settling on her shoulders. This wasn't just domestic terrorism, it was an act of war disguised as civil unrest. Names. I need names. Colonel Mitchell Reeves at Fort Bragg. He's the inside man there. Major Jennifer Liu at Pendleton, turned by Chinese intelligence 3 years ago. General Franklin Pierce, retired, he coordinates between the groups. Hayes continued listing names, each one a dagger to the heart of military integrity. How do you know all this? Because I was supposed to be the Southern coordinator after the November action. They promised me Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, my own little empire. Told me I'd be like Jefferson Davis, leading the new Confederation. His laugh turned into a cough. Stupid. Should have known they'd eliminate me once I outlived my usefulness. The intelligence Hayes provided was immediately classified at the highest levels. Within hours, a joint task force was assembled, including military intelligence, FBI, CIA, and NSA. The scope was staggering: hundreds of conspirators, millions in foreign funding, enough stolen weapons to equip a small army. Steele was appointed operational commander of the military response, reporting directly to the Secretary of Defense. Her first priority was securing the targeted bases without alerting the conspirators. If they knew they'd been exposed, they might accelerate their timeline or go underground. We need to make them think Hayes is dead, she told the task force. Leak to the media that he died from his injuries. Have the prison confirm it. Meanwhile, we use his intel to map the entire network. The deception worked. Hayes's death was reported widely, with conspirators likely breathing easier, thinking their secret had died with him. Meanwhile, surveillance teams tracked every person Hayes had named, building a comprehensive picture of Prometheus. The foreign connections were particularly troubling. NSA intercepts showed Saudi money flowing through shell companies to militia groups. Russian operatives were identified providing training to Constitutional Guard cells. Chinese intelligence had compromised 3 defense contractors, using them to facilitate weapons theft. It's like the Cold War never ended, Webb observed during a strategy session. Just changed shape. Worse, Steele corrected. During the Cold War, we knew who the enemy was. This is warfare by proxy, using American citizens as weapons against their own country. 2 weeks before the planned November 15th action, they were ready to move. Operation Prometheus Rising. The name, chosen with intentional irony, would be the largest domestic counterterrorism action in American history. Simultaneous raids on 147 locations across 12 states, arrests of over 400 conspirators, seizure of weapons caches that would make small nations envious. Steele personally led the raid on Fort Bragg, where Colonel Mitchell Reeves had spent 3 years preparing for this moment. They took him at his home at 3 a.m., finding detailed plans for the arsenal raid and communications equipment linked to Russian intelligence. "You don't understand," Reeves said as they led him away in handcuffs. "The America you serve is already dead. We're just trying to build something from the ashes." "The only thing you're building is a prison cell," Steele replied. Across the country, similar scenes played out. Some conspirators surrendered immediately, overwhelmed by the sudden appearance of federal agents. Others fought back, leading to shootouts that left 17 conspirators and 3 federal agents dead. Major Jennifer Liu at Camp Pendleton attempted to destroy evidence but was caught by cyber surveillance teams who'd been monitoring her systems for weeks. The most dramatic raid occurred in Montana, where a militia compound housing 60 armed conspirators decided to make a stand. The siege lasted 18 hours before tear gas and psychological operations convinced them to surrender. Among those arrested was General Franklin Pierce, the supposed coordinator of Prometheus, who was found hiding in a bunker with gold bars worth millions and passports for 5 different countries. "You think you've won," Pierce told interrogators. "But Prometheus is bigger than us. The fire's already been stolen. You just don't know it yet." His words proved prophetic in an unexpected way. As federal agents celebrated the successful operation, reports began coming in from military bases not on the target list. Small thefts, missing inventory, security breaches that had been overlooked or misfiled. The investigation revealed that while authorities focused on the 5 major targets, smaller operations had been quietly siphoning weapons for months. "It's like a magic trick," Chen explained to Steele. "Show them the big, flashy movement with one hand while the other picks their pocket." The stolen weapons were traced to militia groups, motorcycle clubs, and extremist cells across the country. Not enough for a revolution, but enough for significant domestic terrorism. The real Prometheus wasn't the November 15th operation that was the distraction. The real theft had already happened. Weapons already distributed to groups that had gone dark after the raids. Steele stood in her Pentagon office looking at a map of America covered in red pins, each marking a location to where stolen military weapons had been identified. The Constitutional Guard conspiracy had been stopped. Prometheus prevented, but the underlying poison remained in the American bloodstream. "What's our next move?" Webb asked. "We keep fighting," she said. "Not with raids and arrests, but with the harder work. Community engagement, addressing the grievances that make people vulnerable to extremist recruitment, rebuilding trust between citizens and their government. That could take generations. Then we'd better start now." She thought of Millbrook, of the transformation happening there. One small town choosing reconciliation over revenge, truth over comfortable lies. It wasn't much against the scope of the threat, but it was something. A spark of hope in the darkness, proof that America could heal its self-inflicted wounds. The investigation into Prometheus would continue for years, uncovering cells and connections across the globe. Foreign actors would be exposed and expelled, defense contractors prosecuted, military officers court-martialed. The full scope might never be known, but the immediate threat had been neutralized. Vernon Hayes, still alive despite media reports, eventually testified in closed congressional hearings about Prometheus. His information led to 47 additional arrests and the recovery of weapons worth millions. In exchange, he was placed in witness protection within the federal prison system, spending his remaining years in solitary confinement for his own safety. Tom Dietrich, the reluctant conspirator, who'd shown humanity that night at the Oak, received a reduced sentence for his cooperation. He served 18 months before being released to community service, spending his time speaking to police academies about the danger of corruption and the importance of moral courage. "Every officer faces a moment," he would tell recruits, "when you have to choose between your conscience and your comfort, between what's right and what's easy. I chose wrong, and it destroyed everything I claimed to value. Don't be me. Be the officer who stands up, speaks out, and protects the Constitution, even when it costs you everything." The Judgment Oak continued to stand in its clearing, seasons changing around it, marking time in the slow way of ancient trees. The memorial at its base drew visitors, law enforcement officers seeking inspiration, citizens seeking understanding, historians seeking truth. Each left with their own interpretation of what had happened there and what it meant for America's future. Steele visited one last time before returning to full military duty, standing in the clearing, as autumn painted the leaves in shades of fire. The physical wounds from that night had healed, leaving only faint scars on her wrists. The psychological wounds ran deeper, but had transformed into something else, not trauma, but purpose, not fear, but determination. She thought about Prometheus, the mythological figure who stole fire from the gods and gave it to humanity, suffering eternal punishment for his transgression. The conspirators had seen themselves in that myth, stealing weapons to give to their chosen people willing to suffer for their coups. But they'd misunderstood the story's deeper meaning. Prometheus's gift wasn't just fire, it was knowledge, enlightenment, the ability to see clearly and choose wisely. That was what Millbrook was learning, what America needed to learn. Not the fire of weapons and revolution, but the light of truth and reconciliation. The real theft from the gods wasn't military arsenals, but the comfortable ignorance that allowed extremism to flourish in democracy's shadows. As she drove away from Millbrook for what she knew would be the last time, Steele caught a glimpse of the town in her rearview mirror. New construction was visible, funded by the foundation. The police station flew both American and state flags at full staff, not half-mast as they had for so long. Children played in a park that had been a vacant lot 6 months ago. It wasn't perfect. No place ever was. But it was healing, growing, becoming something better than what it had been. That was all anyone could ask for, all any nation could hope to achieve. Not perfection, but progress. Not immunity from corruption, but resilience against it. Not the absence of darkness, but the presence of those willing to carry light. The highway stretched ahead, leading back to Washington and the endless battles that awaited there. Somewhere in America, new conspiracies were forming, new extremists were recruiting, new threats were emerging. But somewhere else, communities were choosing different paths. Citizens were standing up to corruption. Officers like James Washington were showing what protective service really meant. The war for America's soul would continue, fought in small towns and big cities, in clearings beneath ancient oaks and corridors of power, in the hearts of citizens faced with choices between fear and hope, hatred and justice, the comfortable lie and the difficult truth. The war might continue indefinitely, but individual battles could still be won. And Steele had one more battle to fight before she could consider her mission complete. 3 months after the Prometheus raids, she received intelligence that changed everything she thought she knew about the conspiracy. Marcus Webb delivered the news personally to her Pentagon office, his face grave. "Amara, we've decoded the hard drives from Pierce's bunker. There's something you need to see." He handed her a tablet displaying financial records, communication logs, and most disturbingly, a list of names under the heading Phase 3. Her blood chilled as she recognized several names: senators, federal judges, even a member of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. "Prometheus wasn't the end," she said quietly. "It was the middle." Phase 1 was establishing the network through groups like the Constitutional Guard, Webb confirmed. Phase 2 was Prometheus arming the foot soldiers. Phase 3. He paused, struggling with the implications. Phase 3 is the coup. Legitimate political and military leaders who've been compromised or converted. They were going to wait until the chaos from Prometheus created a crisis, then step in as saviors to restore order. A coup disguised as crisis management. Steele studied the names, noting the strategic positions they held. With these people in place, they could effectively take control of the government while maintaining the appearance of constitutional authority. "It gets worse," Look at the date for Phase 3 activation. She found it buried in the coded communications. January 20th, Inauguration Day, when security would be focused on protecting the incoming administration, when the peaceful transfer of power would be at its most vulnerable. We have to assume they're still planning this, Steele said. The Prometheus raids didn't touch these people. They're still in position. The FBI is being briefed as we speak. But Amara, some of these names, Senator Patricia Hawthorne is on the Intelligence Committee. General David Russo oversees nuclear weapons security. If we move against them without ironclad proof, it could trigger the very crisis they want to exploit. She set down the tablet, mind racing through possibilities. We need someone on the inside, someone they trust who can gather that proof. That's why I'm here. There's a name on the Phase 3 list who might be turned. Colonel Sarah Chen, she's General Russo's aide. Her brother was killed in Afghanistan by an IED that used stolen American weapons. If she knew Russo was part of the conspiracy that armed extremists, she might help us. Steele considered the risks. Approaching her could blow the entire operation if she's truly committed to their cause. Or she could be our key to stopping a coup. The approach to Colonel Chen required delicate planning. They couldn't use official channels, too many potential leaks. Instead, Steele arranged an accidental encounter at a veterans fundraiser in Alexandria where Chen was speaking about Gold Star families. After Chen's moving speech about sacrifice and service, Steele approached during the reception. Colonel Chen, powerful words, your brother would be proud. Chen's expression tightened slightly. She knew who Steele was. Everyone in military circles did after Millbrook. General Steele, I wouldn't have expected to see you here. I try to support Gold Star families when I can. Mind if we speak privately? I have something you need to hear about your brother's death. The calculation in Chen's eyes was visible curiosity warring with caution. Finally, she nodded, following Steele to a quiet corner of the venue. Your brother was killed by an IED in Kandahar province, Steele said quietly. What you don't know is that the weapons used in that device were part of a shipment stolen from Fort Gordon 6 months before his death. Weapons that were supposed to be destroyed, but were instead sold to extremists. Chen's face paled. That's impossible. The investigation said, the investigation was compromised. The people responsible for your brother's death aren't just in Afghanistan, Colonel. They're here in uniform in positions of power, and one of them is your commanding officer. You're lying. But the words lacked conviction. Chen had suspected something. Steele could see it in her eyes. General Russo has been part of the conspiracy from the beginning. He facilitated weapons theft, provided intelligence to extremist groups, and now he's part of something even worse. Steele pulled out a phone showing Chen select documents from Pierce's files. They call it Phase 3, a coup scheduled for Inauguration Day. Chen studied the documents, her military bearing cracking, as she recognized authentication codes, communication protocols that would be nearly impossible to fake. My God, David, General Russo was my brother's mentor. He spoke at his funeral. And now he's planning to overthrow the government your brother died defending. The question is, Colonel, what are you going to do about it? The silence stretched between them before Chen straightened, decision made. What do you need? Over the following weeks, Chen became their eyes and ears inside Russo's operation. She wore recording devices to meetings, copied classified documents, and slowly mapped the full scope of Phase 3. The conspiracy was more sophisticated than anyone had imagined. Not a violent overthrow, but a constitutional crisis carefully engineered to justify emergency measures. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. On Inauguration Day, coordinated terrorist attacks would occur at multiple locations, not the ceremony itself, but symbolic targets that would create maximum panic. During the chaos, compromised officials would invoke emergency protocols, effectively suspending normal government operations. General Russo would assume control of nuclear forces for security. Senator Hawthorne would lead congressional calls for martial law, and federal judges would rubber stamp every power grab as constitutional necessity. "They're not destroying democracy," Chen reported during a clandestine meeting. "They're hollowing it out from inside, keeping the shell while replacing everything within." "Like a parasite," Steele agreed, "using the host's body while killing it slowly." The evidence Chen gathered was damning, but also revealed a critical weakness in the conspiracy. Not all Phase 3 participants knew about each other. The plot was compartmentalized, with different cells operating independently. Senator Hawthorne didn't know about General Russo's nuclear plans. Russo didn't know about the federal judges. They were united in purpose but divided in operation. "We can use that," Steele told the task force. "Take them down in sequence, make each arrest look unrelated. By the time they realize we're on to Phase 3, it'll be too late." The operation began 2 weeks before inauguration. Federal Judge Marcus Bryant was arrested on corruption charges that seemed unrelated to terrorism bribes from defense contractors that happened to be part of the Prometheus network. Senator Hawthorne was detained for questioning about campaign finance violations that led to extremist groups. Each arrest was portrayed as isolated routine law enforcement. General Russo proved more challenging. As a sitting general with access to nuclear weapons, arresting him risked triggering the very crisis they were trying to prevent. They needed him to incriminate himself beyond any doubt. Chen provided the opportunity. He wants to meet with the full Phase 3 leadership. January 18th, 2 days before inauguration. They're getting nervous about the arrests, want to confirm everyone's still committed. Where? A hunting lodge in West Virginia. Private property, no official record of the gathering. It was perfect, all the conspirators in one place away from their power bases discussing their treason in detail. Steele personally led the surveillance team that surrounded the lodge, using military-grade equipment to record every word spoken inside. The conspirators arrived throughout the day, each more paranoid than the last. Through parabolic microphones and Chen's hidden recorder, the task force heard everything. Bryant and Hawthorne were isolated incidents, Russo assured the gathering. "Our sources confirm the investigations aren't related to Phase 3. "Your sources are wrong," another voice said. Steele recognized it as Congressman James Mitchell from Texas. "There's been chatter about a task force, something called Prometheus Rising. That was the operation against the November action. It's over." "Is it? Then why are our people disappearing?" The meeting devolved into accusations and finger-pointing, conspirators turning on each other as paranoia took hold. Then Russo said the words that sealed his fate. "Enough, in 48 hours we execute Phase 3 as planned. The attacks are set, our people are in position. Once the bombs go off, the country will beg us to take control. Constitution be damned, we're saving America from itself." The task force had what they needed. As the conspirators prepared to leave, believing themselves safe, hundreds of federal agents emerged from concealment. The arrests were swift, professional, and complete. Every member of Phase 3 was taken into custody simultaneously, their plot dying in a West Virginia winter. Russo, faced with overwhelming evidence, tried one last gambit. "You don't understand what you're preventing. America is dying, rotted by immigration, secularism, loss of traditional values. We were trying to save it." "By destroying everything it stands for," Steele responded. "The Constitution isn't just paper, General. It's a promise that all people are created equal, that government serves the people, not the other way around. You forgot that promise." "Pretty words," Russo spat. "But words won't stop the collapse that's coming." "No," Steele agreed. But people will. People who choose democracy over authoritarianism, difficult truths over comfortable lies, the hard work of governance over the easy path of force. The inauguration proceeded without incident, the public never knowing how close they'd come to losing their democracy. The Phase 3 conspirators were tried in federal court, their sentences ranging from 20 years to life. General Russo received the harshest penalty, life without parole, for treason, the first American general convicted of that crime since the Civil War. Colonel Sarah Chen testified in the trials, her courage in exposing the conspiracy, earning her both commendation and criticism. She continued serving, eventually promoted to general, dedicating her career to ensuring military integrity and preventing future conspiracies. Tom Dietrich, released early for good behavior, attended the trials as a civilian observer. Afterward, he approached Steele outside the courthouse. "I've been following everything," he said. "Prometheus Phase 3, all of it, makes what happened in Millbrook look small." "It was all connected," Steele replied. Millbrook was a test run seeing if local corruption could be weaponized for national goals. If Hayes had succeeded, there would have been 1,000 Millbrooks. Tom paused, gathering courage. "I wanted to thank you, General. Not for exposing us, we deserved that. But for what came after. For helping the town heal instead of just leaving it to rot." "Healing is harder than destroying," Steele said. "But it's the only thing that actually defeats extremism. You can't kill an ideology with bullets. You have to replace it with something better." Tom nodded, understanding. "My daughter started talking to me again. Said she saw the testimony, understood why I did what I did, even if she can't forgive it yet. That's more than I hoped for." As he walked away, Steele reflected on the strange paths redemption could take. Tom Dietrich, former corrupt cop, was now teaching ethics at the police academy. Vernon Hayes, architect of conspiracy, had inadvertently exposed a plot that could have destroyed American democracy. The Judgment Oak, symbol of oppression, had become a monument to justice. 6 months after the Phase 3 arrests, Steele returned once more to Millbrook. The town had continued its transformation. New businesses lined Main Street, the police department had won state recognition for community engagement, and children played in parks that had been crime scenes a year earlier. She stood again beneath the Judgment Oak, now surrounded by a small park with benches and walking paths. Families picnicked where conspirators had once plotted revolution. Children climbed the same roots where she'd been tied and humiliated. The tree had witnessed it all, absorbing each moment into its rings of memory. Angela Hayes had sent a letter from Oregon reporting that she'd started a nonprofit helping families escape extremist groups. "What happened to us," she wrote, "shouldn't happen to anyone else. But it does every day in small towns across America where good people are trapped by bad systems. I'm trying to help them find a way out, the way you helped Millbrook find a way forward." Dolores from the diner approached, carrying 2 cups of coffee. "Thought you might want this," she said, handing one to Steele. "It's a cold morning." They stood together in comfortable silence before Dolores spoke again. "You know I hated you at first, blamed you for everything that happened. But I've been thinking you didn't cause our problems. You just revealed them. Like lancing an infection. Hurts like hell, but it's the only way to heal." "Millbrook is healing because its people chose to heal," Steele said. "I just provided an opportunity." "Maybe, but opportunities don't mean nothing without someone brave enough to take them." Dolores gestured to the oak. "This tree's seen a lot of history. Bad history, mostly. But my grandmother once told me it wasn't always called the Judgment Oak. Used to be the Treaty Oak, where indigenous tribes met with settlers to negotiate peace. Maybe it can be that again, a place where different people come together to find common ground." "That's a better name," Steele agreed. The treaty oak, a place for reconciliation, not retribution. As the morning sun climbed higher, warming the January air, more people arrived at the park. Some came to pay respects at the memorial, others simply to enjoy a peaceful morning in a place that had known too little peace. Steele recognized faces from that first night, Earl, who'd talked about the tree's older stories, young couples who'd been part of the overnight vigil, even some former officers who'd served under Hayes but chosen to cooperate with authorities. James Washington, the veteran who'd taken over as police chief, arrived with his family. His children ran immediately to the playground that had been built near the oak, their laughter echoing through branches that had heard too much crying. "General Nutt," Washington greeted her. "Didn't expect to see you back." "Last visit," she said. "I'm being deployed overseas next month. Thought I should see how the investment turned out." "Better than anyone expected. Crime's down 60%. Business licenses up 40%. And we just got a grant to build a new community center." He paused, watching his children play. "My kids go to school here now. That's how much I trust what we've built." The gathering grew throughout the morning, an impromptu celebration of survival and renewal. Someone had brought a guitar, not for the mockery of that terrible night, but for music that lifted spirits. Children sang songs they'd learned in school about justice and equality. Adults shared stories of rebuilding, of neighbors helping neighbors, of a community choosing its better angels. As noon approached, Steele prepared to leave. She had a flight to catch, a new assignment, waiting other battles to fight in democracy's endless war against its own worst impulses. But before she could reach her car, a young girl approached, maybe 10 years old, with serious eyes and carefully braided hair. "Are you the general?" she asked. "I am. My teacher said you were brave, that you let bad people hurt you so everyone could see how bad they were." Steele knelt to meet the girl's eyes. Sometimes being brave means accepting hurt so others won't be hurt worse. But the really brave ones are the people who stayed here and rebuilt after the bad people were gone. Like your teacher, your parents, your neighbors. They're the real heroes. The girl considered this. "My daddy was one of the bad people's friends. He's in jail now. Mama says he made bad choices, but he's trying to be better." "Everyone makes choices," Steele said carefully. "Some good, some bad. What matters is learning from the bad ones and making better ones next time." "Will my daddy get a next time?" "I hope so. And when he does, you can help him make good choices. That's what family does, help each other be better." The girl nodded solemnly and ran back to her mother, who nodded gratefully at Steele. Another family touched by the conspiracy, another generation that would carry either hatred or healing forward. As Steele finally drove away from Millbrook, she saw it all in her rearview mirror, the town that had been a casualty of American extremism, the oak that had witnessed centuries of both cruelty and courage, the people who'd chosen difficult reconciliation over easy revenge. It wasn't perfect. Maybe it never would be. But it was better and getting better still. The highway stretched ahead toward Washington, toward new challenges and old struggles. The Constitutional Guard was broken. Prometheus exposed, Phase 3 prevented. But somewhere in some other small town or big city, new conspiracies were forming. New Vernon Hayes characters were exploiting grievances. New extremists were planning violence. Yet also somewhere new heroes were standing up. New communities were choosing courage. New Americans were defending democracy, not with weapons, but with witness, not with violence, but with votes, not with conspiracy, but with conscience. The war for America's soul would continue perhaps forever. But battles could be won, towns could be saved, trees of judgment could become oaks of treaty. And sometimes, in the right light, with the right people making the right choices, the arc of the moral universe could be seen bending toward justice. General Amara Steele had been tied to a tree, humiliated, nearly broken. But she had not broken. Neither had American democracy, though it had been tested to its limits. Both had emerged scarred, but stronger wounded, but wiser challenged, but ultimately triumphant. The oak would continue standing, seasons cycling through their eternal dance. New rings would form in its trunk, recording years of peace where once there had been violence, hope where once there had been hatred. Children not yet born would play in its shade, never knowing. It had been a place of evil, knowing only that it was a place where people came to remember that democracy requires eternal vigilance, that freedom demands courage, and that justice, though it may tarry, will not sleep forever. In her Pentagon office that evening, Steele filed her final report on the Millbrook intervention. She detailed the economic recovery, the social healing, the restoration of legitimate governance. She included recommendations for other communities facing similar challenges, lessons learned from both success and failure. But she also included something else, a photograph of the treaty oak. She'd decided to use Dolores's name for it, with children playing beneath its branches. A reminder that the work of democracy wasn't just about stopping conspiracies or arresting criminals. It was about creating spaces where children could play safely, where families could gather freely, where communities could choose their own futures without fear. Marcus Webb read the report that night, noting Steele's recommendation that the military establish a permanent liaison program with communities recovering from extremist infiltration. Hearts and minds operations but for American citizens, she'd written. The same strategies we use to build democracy abroad can help rebuild it at home. He approved the recommendation, knowing it would face resistance from those who saw domestic engagement as outside the military's purview. But after Prometheus, after Phase 3, the old boundaries seemed less important than the urgent need to protect democracy from all enemies, foreign and domestic. The program would eventually expand to dozens of communities, military veterans, helping civilians reclaim their towns from extremist influence. It would be called the Treaty Oak Initiative, named for a tree that had witnessed America at its worst and chose to keep growing toward the light. Vernon Hayes died in federal prison 5 years later, alone and unmourned except by the most extreme adherents of his cause. His legacy wasn't the revolution he'd planned, but the revelation he'd caused, exposing the networks of hatred and conspiracy that threatened American democracy, forcing the nation to confront its own capacity for self-destruction. Tom Dietrich continued teaching at police academies for 20 years, training thousands of officers in ethical decision-making and moral courage. He never forgot the night at the Oak, using it as a teaching tool, how a single moment of moral failure could destroy everything, but also how redemption remained possible for those willing to do the hard work of earning it. The Judgment Oak, now officially renamed the Treaty Oak, in Millbrook's records, stood through it all. Storms came and passed. Lightning struck but didn't fell. Seasons cycled in their ancient pattern. And always, always it grew toward light, toward sky, toward something better than what had been. In its shade, democracy continued its messy, magnificent experiment. Not perfect, never perfect, but perfectible. Not complete, never complete, but always becoming. The tree stood witness to it all, its roots deep in dark history, its branches reaching toward brightening tomorrow, proving that from the worst ground, with enough time and care and courage, something beautiful could still grow.